Welcome, dear listener, to the 20th episode of the BioLogic podcast. This is going to be a particularly exciting episode because it's all about natural selection. In the previous episode, I introduced the theory of evolution and I discussed some of its basic components. I briefly discussed natural selection and its variables: fitness, adaptations, and heritability. You should find a comfortable place to relax and listen, because today I'm going to dive headfirst into the material and conclude with a few examples of natural selection at work. With that said, I'll start at the top, with the process of natural selection as a whole, and then break it down into its subcomponents and mechanisms. First and foremost, natural selection does exactly as the name implies. The rigors of the environment put pressure on organisms to survive and reproduce. Those with a high fitness will reproduce and pass on their genes, while those with a low fitness will fail to reproduce, and their genes will be slowly weeded out from the gene pool. Nature does not act like a god or a machine when choosing which organisms to kill and which species to doom. Nature is what it is. Look outside your window. You probably see trees dotting a landscape. You probably see dirt and grass, or maybe hills or some mountains. If you're listening to this in the winter, you probably see snow covering everything. The sky is gray. The branches of the trees are bare and empty. The wind is cold and bitter. This is a natural landscape, a habitat, and its qualities influence the resilience and the diversity of the life that can dwell there. The plants and animals that live in your local habitat have been sculpted by eons of natural selection to fit comfortably into it. You are an organism, an animal, and you're swimming in a gene pool called the human species. We've been around in our modern morphology for about 200,000 years. We've been diverging from our bonobo and chimpanzee cousins for more than 5 million years. And 66 million years ago, our mammalian ancestors achieved dominance over the planet by proxy of most dinosaurs being wiped out by the KT extinction event. That was natural selection in action. The meteor induced a tremendous change in the environment. It threw up ash and dust, which blocked out the sun, and planetary temperatures subsequently plunged. Many plant species died off from the lack of heat and light, as did the dinosaurs that depended on them for food, as well as the carnivores who depended on those for food. Those that didn't starve to death would freeze, unable to handle the darkness and the cold. But the mammals, with their smaller, fur-covered bodies, their burrowing behaviors, and their milk-fed offspring, were able to endure the cold and the dark until the ash cleared and the sun once again warmed the surface of the earth. The mammals would then spread out across an emptied world and rapidly evolve to fit into the emergent habitats that now existed in a world without dinosaurs for the first time in hundreds of millions of years. This is how natural selection works. The environment makes staying alive hard and reproducing even harder. Those that can endure the harsh environments the best are more likely to survive and reproduce than those who can't. As a result, their genes get perpetuated through time in the form of descendants and offspring. Those individuals who can't endure the rigors of the environment, those who fail to thrive or reproduce, well, they die out, and whatever genetic contribution they could give to the gene pool gets snuffed out with them. In the last episode, I discussed the finches that Darwin observed on the Galapagos Islands. Each species of finch had adapted in certain ways to its home island, depending on the specific pressures and obstacles in each island habitat. For example, some islands had large, heavy seeds, and these were difficult to break open. The finches ate these seeds for food, so if there was any individual finch who was too small and weak to break open the seeds, he'd be unable to feed himself. He would starve to death. Meanwhile, those individuals with large, strong beaks would have no trouble getting food. The individuals with large, strong beaks could feed themselves better. As a result, they were larger, with a brighter plumage, and generally superior health compared to their smaller, weaker brethren, who struggled to crack open the seeds. The stronger finches would reproduce more often, and as beak size was a heritable trait, subsequent generations of the finch population would have more and more individuals with this large, strong beak. Meanwhile, on another island, the available seeds are small and difficult to pick out of the dirt. Finches on islands like this developed long, thin beaks, perfect for fine motor control and visual clarity. Individuals with big, clumsy beaks wouldn't be able to handle their food as well, and they'd be outcompeted by the smaller, more nimble finches. The larger-beaked individuals would be more likely to be malnourished or starve to death because they're being outcompeted. and both of these outcomes reduce their reproductive success. If you're dead, you can't reproduce. If you're starving, you can barely feed yourself, let alone a child. On some islands, food was plentiful, and the resident finches grew large and complacent. On others, food was scarce and the competition intense, so the resident finches became smaller and faster. The islands had other differences too, like particular predators or plant species that interacted in some way with the finches. Let these trends continue for hundreds of thousands to millions of years, and you'll start to see pronounced and obvious differences between groups of species that all descended from a single ancestral population. I should really mention the inspiring work of the scientists Rosemary and Peter Grant, who've spent more than 4 decades cataloging the finch populations on the Galapagos Islands, tagging them and recording their traits. Because the islands they study are small, the finch populations are small, and in some cases, like with the island Daphne Major, they've tagged the entire population of finches that lived there. Their exhaustive efforts have produced some of the most accurate, real-time data on evolutionary changes in the finch populations. For example, in 1977, Daphne Major experienced a serious drought, where the island received less than a fifth of the rain that it usually gets in the wet season. As the native plants struggled to produce seeds in the drought, the finch population crashed by nearly 84%. The finches cracked open the seeds to eat them for food, and when hardly any seeds could be grown, the finch's food source all but disappeared. The original finch population on Daphne Major had over 750 individuals, but after the drought, the population was reduced to less than 100. Peter and Rosemary Grant had measured that the population of finches had an average beak size of about 9.4 millimeters from top to bottom. After measuring the beaks of the drought survivors, they calculated that the surviving population had an average beak size of 10.1 millimeters. That's a gain of almost 1 millimeter from a single selection event. So how did this happen? What led to the increased average size of the beaks? During the drought, when their primary food source wasn't available, the finches had to find other food sources to survive. One such alternative food source was the fruits of the Tribulus cystoides plant, which had tough, sturdy fruits that were difficult to crack open. In normal conditions, the finches ignored these plants because they were too difficult to open relative to the abundant, easier-to-access seeds that they usually ate. But when the drought removed their primary food source, the finches were forced by the circumstances of their environment to eat from the Tribulus cystoides fruits. Individual finches with smaller or weaker beaks couldn't crack them open. They couldn't get to the fruit, and they starved to death. Individuals with larger beaks had more success cracking open the fruits, and they were thus better able to feed themselves and survive. Before the drought, about 50 individuals out of a population of 751, or about 6.7% of the population, had beaks smaller than 8 millimeters. After the drought, there were only 3 individuals out of a population of 90 survivors, or 3.33%, that had beaks smaller than 8 millimeters. What this means is that the selection event, the drought, cut the percent of small-beaked finches in the population in half. The alleles that code for smaller beaks became less frequent in the population, while the alleles for larger beaks became more frequent. This is a measurable evolutionary change, and it took place over a single year, with a single selection pressure. It might make a little more sense now how we have such a huge diversity of species, given the fact that life on Earth has had almost 3.6 billion years to evolve. Anyways, the Grants didn't just study the effects of drought. They also saw how heavy rainfall affected the islands. In 1983, the islands received almost 10 times the amount of rain that they usually get. This burst of hydration enabled plant life to thrive, and in total contrast to the drought of 1977, the heavy rainfall enabled the plants to produce a tremendous amount of seeds. Instead of having their main food source largely disappear, the finches enjoyed an overabundance of food. These environmental conditions were more conducive to the reproduction of smaller finches, with smaller, pointier beaks, and as a result, their associated alleles increased in frequency in the population. The finches with smaller, pointier beaks had a higher fitness than the finches with larger beaks in this new environment, and they reproduced more often. As a result, the gene pool of the finch population had evolved a higher frequency of alleles associated with smaller, pointier beaks. The Galapagos finches are a perfect example to demonstrate the value of fitness. In evolutionary terms, fitness is the capacity for the organism to thrive in its environment, such that it can reproduce and pass on its genes to the next generation. Those individuals poorly suited to their environment, like the small-beaked finches on an island with big seeds, those individuals just can't sustain themselves as well against the rigors and challenges of the environment. They don't survive as long, and they usually fail to reproduce. Understand that this natural selection pressure doesn't just apply to animals and their food source. It applies to virtually everything that affects mortality and reproductive rate. For example, many species of plant and fungus adapted to use the wind as a mechanism for reproduction, wherein the plant or fungus releases a cloud of tiny little spores, and these get carried on the wind to get physically deposited on other plants or fungi, which then get fertilized. There's a selection pressure inherent in this mechanism. If your spores are too heavy, they won't catch the wind or travel very far. Your spores have to be light, small and light enough so that the wind can carry them a significant distance away. Other kinds of reproductive mechanisms have their own selection pressures. Some trees have adapted seeds covered in a sticky slime, or covered in hooks or spikes, and these seeds get caught in the fur of passing animals. As the animal moves around, the seed gets carried along, and it eventually falls off, where it has the chance at finding adequate soil and germinating. As the animal walks by the plant, its fur rubs up against it, and these seeds, with their sticky surface or their hooks or whatever, get caught in the fur, and they get plucked off the plant. As the animal moves around, the seed gets carried with it, until it eventually falls off. When it falls off, it has a chance at finding adequate soil and germinating, where it'll grow into another plant, like a tree or a fern or whatever it happens to be. In this case, the selective pressures of the environment prefer stickier seeds, or thornier seeds. If the seeds aren't sticky or thorny, they won't stick. They'll just fall around the tree, on ground that's already permeated with tree roots. If the seeds are too sticky, or too thorny, or whatever, and they don't readily fall off the animal, they might just stick onto the animal until it dies, or until the seed rots in its fur. Consider an ecosystem, like a forest, spread across some mountain valley. At the bottom of the mountain valley, the soil is rich in nutrients and moist with the runoff from the mountains. But on the edges of the valley, higher up on the sides of the mountains, the soil is thin and dry. There might be a few streams, but they're small, and the air is cold. The plants that grow at the bottom of the valley have access to plentiful nutrients, so a lot of different species can grow and thrive there. As the forest canopy grows to block out the light, plants have to find ways to access as much light as possible. This is a selection pressure on the smaller plants and shorter trees in the valley floor. On the other hand, as water is abundant here, these plants don't need to worry about drought. Going without a lack of water is not a selective pressure for them. Going without water is not a threat that they're really exposed to. But if we go up the mountainsides, higher up in altitude, the density of trees and other plants decreases. If you look at a mountainside, you might notice that at a certain point up its side, there aren't any trees anymore. It's only mosses or grasses or something like that, or shrubs. And this is because the soil just can't support trees. There simply isn't enough water or nutrients to support that kind of biomass, so only smaller plants can grow there. Even though the plants higher up on the mountain aren't densely packed and they don't really overlap, so they have access to all the light that they need. Despite this, the soil is less nutritious and significantly drier. Up here, water and nutrients are the limiting factors instead of light. The plants that do grow up here experience a selection pressure to endure chronic drought, and they likely don't grow to be very tall or thick. All the species of plant in this forest develop adaptations that are tempered by the harsh realities of their natural habitat. These adaptations are the evolved characteristics of a population that enable a higher fitness for their habitat. Adaptations are gradual developments of an entire population or species. They typically aren't landmark changes that come about with a small number of individuals. As natural selection works on a population through time, less fit individuals are culled, and more fit individuals have their genes preserved through their offspring. In each generation, there will be some individuals with a relatively higher fitness, and those with a relatively lower fitness. Those with a higher fitness survive to pass on their genes, and this influences the gene pool of future generations. The gradual accumulation of this influence creates adaptations in the species as a whole, forged by the processes of natural selection. Because every generation has its individuals with relatively high fitness and those with low fitness, this process of natural selection is perpetually affecting the population. If you watched my interview with Neil deGrasse Tyson, you might remember when he discussed how primates had to reliably grab branches as they swung through the trees, otherwise they would fall to their injury or death. This selection pressure gradually induced a change that we call an adaptation. The primate's eyes are positioned on the front of its head, with overlapping fields of vision, which provides binocular vision and depth perception. Other animals that didn't have to rely on grabbing branches to swing from place to place didn't have this selection pressure, and they kept their eyes on the sides of their head, like fish, horses, goats, and most birds. Owls, as well as other predatory birds, have eyes on the front of their heads because they also need depth perception. When owls and falcons and eagles and other raptors make their diving attacks on prey animals, or when they attack one another in midair, their lives depend on their ability to perceive three-dimensional space. Binocular vision gives them this depth perception that maximizes their ability to catch prey or to fight off an attacker. Notice that binocular vision and eyes on the front of the head are common in almost all predator species, as predators require depth perception to adequately track, intercept, and catch their prey. Felines like lions, tigers, jaguars, and your pet cat, and caniforms like wolves and bears and your pet dog, all have this binary vision and depth perception characteristic of predators. Notice that herbivorous prey animals, like gazelles and moose and caribou, all have eyes on the sides of their head. They don't really have depth perception, but then again, they don't necessarily need it. They don't have to worry about swinging from vines or tree branches, or tracking down and tackling their food. Herbivores eat plants, and plants aren't going to run away anytime soon. Prey animals don't have to hunt down their food, but they do have to keep an eye out for predators. For them, natural selection has sculpted an adaptation maximizing their field of view. The animals almost have a full 360-degree field of view. This adaptation helps them detect and avoid predators. Those individuals with the best field of view have the best chance at detecting a predator before it can sneak up and pounce. They have the best chance at seeing a danger coming from a distance and escaping, which improves their chances at reproducing. Natural selection isn't limited to the influence of the material environment on a population. Natural selection also takes place within populations, as individuals compete with one another to get sex, to get a chance to reproduce. Consider the peacock, with its huge, brightly colored tail feathers. These males possess this colorful display, but the female does not. Instead, the female is attracted to large and brightly colored tails. The females seek out the males with the largest, brightest tail feathers, and they choose to mate with them. In many cases, this can lead to a positive feedback loop called a Fisherian runaway. Basically, with this kind of sexual selection, as the species propagates itself through time, one gender develops a genetically rooted attraction towards some kind of trait, and the other gender develops that trait to exaggerated proportions. In the case of peacocks, the females are choosy, and they only choose the males with the most fabulous tail feathers. As a result, subsequent generations have tail feathers that get larger and brighter. The stimulus response of the sexual selection has created a Fisherian runaway effect. The Fisherian runaway effect is largely manifested in sexual dimorphism and various male ornamentations like the peacock's tail. Consider human beings. We are a species with sexual dimorphism. That is, our male and female genders have noticeable physical differences. These differences play a large role in human mating, and they've created exaggerated features. Both the breasts and penises of humans are larger relative to our body size than those of any other primate species. Preferences for things like larger breasts or wider hips or larger penises has induced a sexual selection pressure in human populations, and over hundreds of thousands and millions of years, this has given us larger external genitals and larger mammary glands than any of our closest evolutionary relatives. But sexual selection isn't limited to just Fisherian runaways. Other factors are involved in sexual selection, like traits that increase an individual's access to reproductive opportunities. Think something like the antlers on various deer species. These antlers aren't used to defend the stags from environmental pressures, they're used to fight off other stags. The deer use these horns as a tool for combat. Males with larger antlers can typically fight off those with smaller horns, and as a result, these males get to enjoy more time with the female elk. Because larger antlers on the stag enables it to get access to sex more often, sexual selection offers a higher fitness to stags with bigger, stronger antlers. This is also the case with the horns and skulls of rams, who fight over females by headbutting each other until one submits and runs away. All of the examples I've given you today have been examples of natural selection in action. Natural selection is the varying levels of reproductive success in a population with varied individuals. Those individuals in a given generation who are better suited to their environment will thrive, while those who can't endure are culled. Across multiple generations, this effect can be seen, sculpting the genome of the species. This is what happened to the population of finches on Daphne Major, who experienced a drought that took away their primary food source. By being forced to eat a more difficult-to-access food, the finches experienced a strong evolutionary pressure, and their morphology changed. The frequency of alleles associated with those traits changed. This is exactly what happens to the plants that are trying to spread their spores and their seeds. It's what happens to the monkeys living in the treetops as they use the branches and vines to swing around town. It's what happens to predators who need binocular vision and depth perception to track down their prey. And it's what happens to the prey animals who survive by avoiding the predators. It's what happens to male peacocks and stags and rams as they fight amongst each other for the attention of females. The drought and then the heavy rainfall on Daphne Major are both examples of how the environment can change, and how an altered habitat induces different selection pressures on the species that live there. Gene pools get pushed towards favoring this trait or that trait, favoring one over the other in response to a perpetual tide of selection pressures that affect the populations for different lengths of time and to different intensities. From another point of view, this really shows how plastic and adaptable organic beings are. As living creatures, living masses of carbon and oxygen and nitrogen, we reproduce ourselves to perpetuate our genes in our bodies through time. This perpetuation is unequal, as some individuals are better able to survive and reproduce than others. The result of this inequality is the gradual alteration of our shared gene pool, working piece by piece in response to selection pressure after selection pressure, pushing our gene pool in this direction or that direction. Traits get modified, and they get modified again, and they get modified again across later generations, and their emergent traits get modified again in a never-ending dance of selection pressure, selection, and adaptation. Natural selection influences the gene pools of every species as time goes on. And all these brief little individual selection pressures, they accumulate in the gene pool. Natural selection influences the gene pools of every species perpetually as time goes on. And all of these brief little individual selection pressures like droughts or some new predator coming in or heavy rainfall, all of these things and all of their induced selection pressures, they accumulate in the gene pool of the species. As a result of these accumulations over evolutionary periods of time, species diverge and form entirely new lineages of plants and animals. And these diverge again, creating more cousin species, and these lineages diverge again and again and again over hundreds of thousands and millions of years. Natural selection is the carving process behind all of evolution. It culls the weak and favors the most fit, and it works as the primary influence for how allele frequencies change in populations through time. It's critical to understand that evolution is not a guided process. It's not a deliberate process. Individuals with otherwise high fitness can still fail to reproduce, and individuals with otherwise low fitness can manage to produce offspring from time to time. But statistically, when you take the whole population into consideration, or long periods of time into consideration, these turn into anomalies against the roaring backdrop of natural selection, as it preserves alleles associated with high fitness and culls those alleles associated with low fitness. In this way, natural selection and evolution does not cause changes in the individual organism. The individuals are born with their alleles, and they will die with those alleles. Natural selection does cause changes in populations, as culling the weak and preserving the fit changes the proportion of the associated alleles in the population's gene pool. Natural selection basically looks at every generation of individuals within a population and sorts who lives and who dies based on the fitness of their phenotype. Those who die cannot reproduce, and their alleles are scrubbed from the gene pool forever. Those who persevere and reproduce will thus flood the next generation with their high fitness alleles, while the low fitness alleles get passed on with lower and lower frequency. Natural selection isn't responsible for creating new traits. It only selects those currently existing traits that offer the best chances at survival and reproduction in the current environment at the current time. New traits are created by mutations, which I'll discuss more in the next episode. In that episode, I'll cover the various mechanisms and phenomena that propagate evolution. Technically, natural selection is one of these mechanisms, but its influence is so strong, and it's so fundamentally important, that I figured it needed an episode all to itself. I hope you enjoyed listening to this episode as much as I enjoyed doing the research and writing the script. Natural selection, and evolution in general, are such fascinating topics. Evolution is a fundamental pillar of modern biology, and natural selection is such a visceral, complex, and fascinating part of the entire field of study. Now that you understand natural selection a little bit more, maybe you'll start noticing examples of natural selection in your daily life, like birds making songs in the search for a mate, or the camouflage of a particular bug, or the response of wild animals to life in the new urban environments created by human beings. Natural selection can be seen in action all around us, so the next time you're outside, take a minute to enjoy the world of living things around you. Appreciate how everything you see, from the trees to the birds to the bees, it's all been sculpted by the perpetual hand of natural selection over untold millions and millions of years. How is that not the coolest thing ever? It's the most fascinating and badass part of biology that I've ever studied, and I hope I was able to give a little bit of that fascination and enthusiasm to you. As always, thanks for listening.
Would you like to support the BioLogic podcast? It's super easy. When you open a new episode, press the like button or share it with your friends. If you aren't subscribed, you should hit the subscribe button so you can enjoy a new episode every week. You can also peruse our official store, which has a ton of cool stuff like hand-designed t-shirts, hoodies, and stickers. All the links you need are in the description section below.